we're frightened, or it happens when we're frightened or overwhelmed beyond our capacity to rebound. I'll say that once more. It's about being frightened or overwhelmed beyond our capacity to rebound. And in a way, I define resilience as this capacity to rebound. That which, when is thwarted, is always there, wanting and needing to come into completion, to execute and to come into completion. And that also became a very big part of my understanding of what happens in trauma and why trauma doesn't get resolved, because we stay in that overwhelmed, thwarted condition.
So how does unresolved trauma make us less resilient, more brittle, or more rigid in our ways of coping, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, basically, trauma uses up our resilience, uses up our capacity. My doctoral dissertation was really just on that. It was called Accumulated Stress, Reserve Capacity, and Dis-ease. So when we lose that reserve capacity, then we are more susceptible to dis-ease and eventually to all kinds of diseases.
How does trauma use up our reserve capacity?
Well, this goes to our core autonomic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that responds involuntarily to all kinds of physiological needs, and to particularly to needs where we have to go between the normal homeostatic needs. So if we need to walk up a hill, our breathing increases. When we're breathing, our level of carbon dioxide increases and decreases and so forth in a normal way. But when we experience threat, all of those delicate homeostatic adjustments are overwhelmed or overloaded, and we go into either fight or flight, that is to say, when there is perceived threat, sympathetic nervous system, or when we perceive life threat. And that's a shutdown state. So sympathetic state is to hyper-arouse ourselves, exactly, to be ready to fight or to flee. And if it gets stuck there, then you have high heart rate and shallow, high breathing. Therapists and people are not, do not understand that nearly as well. And that's when we're shut down. And when we're in this shutdown state, that's when we really lose our capacity to rebound, where we lose our capacity for resilience. And so when we're able to free these autonomic states, like, to me, is the definition of core resilience. There are many other factors, how we beliefs that we have about ourselves. I believe that the core is in this lack of autonomic resilience, autonomic response.
Each one of us was born into this world with a clean slate. There was no concept of pain or joy at the beginning. At the very beginning, we didn't know right from wrong, judgment from compassion, fear from love. And from the first breath we took, it was both the painful and the joyful experiences that helped shape who we are today. How we view the world, how we view ourselves, and how we view those around us. Trauma can shift the scale.
Because if, I'm little and I skin my knee because I'm trying to walk and I don't do a very good job, and I try to find somebody to help me with my skinned knee and I get boxed in my ears, what am I going to learn? I'm certainly going to learn that I can't trust people to help me when I hurt. And over time, I won't even hope for it. Every human being, no matter their age, has to make the heartbreaking adjustment to a world that is full of losses. So if you're a 5-year-old girl or boy and you've just been raped by a family member, yesterday was one world and today and the rest of your life is another. If you're a college student and you were raped on the campus, if you're a combat vet who never saw violence before and you went to war and lost your buddies to IEDs or whatever, you have a before and an after. When trauma begins in early childhood, it's all that is known. There is no before. Trauma involves an event that threatens life or safety. It takes away choice. You don't get to say whether you want it or not, and results in overwhelming fear. When these things happen to human beings, they feel alone, they often are. They feel helpless, they often are. Humiliated and without hope. So following trauma, a portion of the person, if not the whole person, turns inward, away from life.
To live with those intrusive memories of the traumatic event and live with their coping strategies, which were so much about avoiding any reminder of the trauma. But the reality is that after decades of research, only 25% of children, even those with corroborated histories of significant traumatic histories, ever meet the criteria for PTSD. Why? Because childhood trauma is so profoundly different. It happens in the crucible of those early critical relationships and can have devastating effect on a person's development. The one that they now call the developmental trauma disorder. Now that disorder has still not been formally approved, and yet it offers a very powerful framework for understanding how pervasive and persistent the impact of early trauma can be on a person's development. And not just on the child, but on the adolescent and the adult that they will become if we don't successfully resolve the traumatic reaction. So, what do I mean by human development? I'm going to go real simple here. In good human development, what we expect to see is that a person can reliably perceive the world in a fairly objective way and can problem solve and plan for the future in a flexible way. We expect to see that a person can recognize their feelings and tolerate them long enough to learn from them and, most importantly, learn to manage them. We expect that a person will be able to develop a stable sense of identity and a capacity for self-efficacy. And we expect that a person will be able to form trusting relationships and rely on those relationships for support and assistance when most needed. Now, all of those domains of human development depend on a healthy, well-regulated brain. Now, in healthy development, what we see by adulthood is that a person's thinking brain and their emotional brain can work well in tandem, so that when we experience stress or distress, the brain is able to cope and get us back to a steady state.
The stories are vile and messy and disruptive. Traumatized people need attention and assistance, often for a long time. What are we going to do? Choose complicity by turning away in silence? Flit from cause to cause, trying to do something, which is actually sometimes just to make ourselves feel better? Render judgment? Categorize the traumatized as they? If they were more responsible and had made better choices, they would not be suffering. Work with the traumatized will not fit neatly into programs. There's no quick success. We would listen to their stories. Help a complex trauma victim in many ways. The first of those ways is to get training to do so. It is not the sort of thing that you want to do guessing as you go, because we're talking about extremely vulnerable and damaged people who have been hurt by other human beings who are supposed to be helpers. And so when somebody comes into counseling with these kinds of issues in history, it is very important that the helper be a real helper. And so I'm very strong on urging counselors and therapists to get training for dealing with this. Once they have done that, they will understand that one of the first things that you have to do with somebody like that is help them learn how to be safe with you. Because they're not going to trust you, they're not going to believe anything you say. They think it's foolish to do so, and yet they're so desperate for help they're sitting across from you. So you respect their courage, but you take it very, very slowly. And you wait to hear the story until you have what I call a strong alliance, which means they have a sense of who you are in your character, and that you actually have integrity and are safe, and that they know that you see them, and that the way that they feel or are hurt or the confusion that they have is respected by you, and that you will honor them every step of the way. Trauma affects the victim's identity, because if you are, again, a child marinated in trauma as you develop, you think of a small child, they're wondering who they are as they're small, and then they want to know who you are. And then they want to know who their peers are and how to play together and how to respond to authority and how to ask questions and be heard and understood. And what happens when there's complex trauma is the messages that are communicated to the child are, you are trash. You are not worthy of care. Nobody in your world can be trusted. You need to always be vigilant and look for danger. And nobody's ever going to love you. A child is a developing person, and so they are malleable, which means they can be shaped. And if you are being shaped by untrustworthy people, violent people, humiliating people, abusive people, those who are full of rage, it distorts the development of the human being and also teaches them a tremendous number of lies about who they are and their value and what relationships look like, and it leaves huge gaps in understanding things like what love actually is, what it means to speak truth, what it means to be safe. Inflicted by a caregiver involves great betrayal, and it is a different kind of harm than if someone is traumatized by something like an earthquake or a tsunami. It does not so much affect the way that we perceive ourselves and God as it does when a caregiver, such as a parent, grandparent, teacher, a coach, or a pastor, abuses us in some way. It's profoundly confusing in those places about how to think about the self.
It fucking breaks my heart knowing that these little girls are out there. Begging to be not only seen and heard, but actually listened to. And it breaks my heart. The amount of fear and guilt and shame that we as adults live with, and how it impacts our children, how our decisions on what we think is right. It's kids, it's their fault. And the majority of the time, the parents are not looking at themselves and finding fault in what they're doing. They want to blame the child. And 9 times out of 10, it's the parent. is your responsibility as their parent. And I'm speaking to the mothers because I'm a daughter of a narcissistic father. Those mothers who want to bury their head in the sand and act like everything's okay, or act like their spouse would never do such a thing. You are damaging your child if you make the decision to allow them to continue a relationship with a man who demeans, who degrades, who hits, who hurts. Love shouldn't hurt. And that's what they are learning. They are learning love hurts. So when they go out into the world, when they're away from you, you know what they're going to seek out? A love that hurts. Until we rise up and we teach them that no, love doesn't hurt. And you're worth more, and you deserve more, and I'm your protector, and I am going to bulldoze anyone and everyone who ever puts that notion into your head again. Protecting your child is not extreme. Cutting off family members who are abusive and toxic is not extreme. Teaching our children boundaries and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate is not extreme. Speaking to them on an appropriate developmental level about abusers in their family is not extreme. You can depersonalize it while giving them the information that they need to understand and to know that you are their safe person. Because that's what children developing in this cruel fucking society need, is a safe person who is not going to condemn or criticize or not believe or interrupt while they're talking, or to be listening but not listening. These girls need us to shut the fuck up and listen to them. And if they won't talk, maybe it's because you haven't shut the fuck up and you have trained them that they cannot talk to you. Take responsibility for how your child is responding to you. I completely changed my parenting style with my child because it dawned on me, holy fuck, I may have had this wrong. Holy fuck, my approach may be wrong. And I took a hard look at myself. I wasn't doing anything crazy with my kids back then. I was just much more authoritative. Do as I say. You don't really ask questions. I'm the biggest boss. And I went from God to, hey, I'm kind of just like, we're right here. I'm just a little bit above you, but that's only because I'm a grown-up and I'm your parent and I have to be. But we're human. And we're going to get through this as a team. And I make mistakes. And I can be wrong. And you're valuable regardless of any external shit. Grades, behavior, doesn't fucking matter. I love you because you were born, and that's it. I'm a fighter, but coming from a daughter. Whose father was extremely narcissistic. The damage inflicted.
This is the foundation of development, and this is the foundation that is so profoundly affected by childhood trauma. what we see in a traumatized brain are three really critical impacts. The first has to do with that emotional brain becoming literally a survival brain. Why? Because a child growing up in significant trauma has pervasive experiences of feeling fear, unsafe in the very relationships that are supposed to nurture them and guide them, unsafe in their bodies, and unsafe with their feelings, and ultimately even unsafe with their thoughts as they try to make sense of a chaotic and dangerous world. So what we see is an individual with a traumatized brain relies consistently on basic automatic survival responses: fight, flight, and freeze. Now, those can look very different in a child versus an adolescent versus an adult, but they become automatic responses that brain scientists now tell us literally hijack the thinking brain. So much so that one brain scientist called it a hostile takeover of the conscious mind by powerful negative emotions. Now think about that. The implications of that are profound. That the traumatized brain cannot reliably access and use the thinking brain to make the kind of decisions that people need to make.
Just tell them, like, I need an hour. Like, I need 1 hour of no kids, of nothing. I just need to be me for an hour in the room. I just need to go cry. I need to have a breakdown, and then I'm going to come back.
I've been wounded as an adult child of an alcoholic. Because the wounds are inside, sometimes even the victim of the wounds, of the dysfunction of alcoholism, doesn't acknowledge just how pained they truly are. If adult children of alcoholics wore their bruises on the outside and they went through life with black eyes or battered skin or bite marks on their necks or their arms or their legs, or if the skin on their back was ripped open from some type of a leather strap, then the world would be up in arms over the abuse that an adult child of an alcoholic had to tolerate as children. And we would get so much more validation and we would feel so much more real.
It's hard to come out and say that I was a victim and that I was abused, especially when you're little, because it's like a big secret that's always on your back and that you never know when it's going to come out.
Trauma is an overwhelming event. It takes away our safety, it creates a sense of helplessness, and it continues to affect our perception of our reality.
Some of the telltale signs of trauma are quite evident. Many of these symptoms, it's not that we don't see them, it's that we don't put together the entire sort of picture of what trauma is. Inability to sleep or interrupted sleep, inability to focus on what's going on, really not able to attend to learning. Adults need to be aware of children who are exposed to violence and intervene early and stop it.
Trauma is defined in a million different ways, but to cut it simply, I'm just going to say trauma is any time an experience overwhelms our ability to cope. So anytime your threshold is here and the experience goes above it to where you start to experience distressing symptoms, that is trauma. Which leads me to my second point, which is that trauma is incredibly subjective. Nobody gets to decide what is trauma except for you and you alone. Two people could be in the same car accident. One person could walk away and say, I'm going to sleep like a baby tonight. I'm really glad I survived that one. Where somebody else could walk away, have distressing nightmares, flashbacks, sweat every time they get behind the wheel of the car. There's a lot of reasons why that. Just to say, anybody gets to decide what their trauma is. No one gets to decide for you. Trauma, what's going on in the brain? Let's talk about that. Again, to cut it simply, there's two different kinds of memory. Ready? So the first kind of memory is, I have a yummy meal, it tastes really good, and I can remember every single bite. A very short time later, that memory becomes factual memory. I know I had a good meal, I went to this restaurant, I think I remember a little bit about the waiter, and that's about it. This is the process that we want to happen with any experience, but what we know is something breaks down in that process when it comes to trauma. The memory stays stuck in this emotional experiential place instead of moving into the factual place. So as soon as something triggers the traumatic experience in any way, a sound, a noise, a smell, a word, all of a sudden, boom, our body is reacting as if it is present day. It did not get the memo that this is the past. It can be extreme and severe in cases of flashback or even repeated nightmares, or it can be more subtle in terms of sweat, elevated heart rate, breathing faster and shallow, upset stomach, or even more subtle than that in the emotions, where suddenly we're very angry or very aggressive or full of anxiety.
Right, the child just made a mistake, or the child didn't know an answer. It wasn't that they're a bad person again, and the teacher is shaming them and humiliating them. Humiliation is a form of chronic shame. Shame has a biological function, again, to keep us from doing things that interfere with the social group. Humiliation is valueless. It only breeds corrosive emotions.
This question of need-based shame. And what I mean by that is the embarrassment that comes up, whether it's in children or adults, when they have needs. And sometimes that particularly can come up around being ill or aging, and suddenly there's this big embarrassment. And I'm just sort of, I'm wondering, because we often see need-based shame as some kind of attachment wounding. I wonder if you see it in that way, and if you do see it in that way, when we work with it, are we working first with attachment and then with the shaming, or how do you even see the need-based shame kind of piece?
Well, I'm going to insert something here first. Not shyness. And shyness is a natural developmental phase of vulnerability, and also the feeling that someone, the adult, the parent, can see through you, see into you. And that can evoke a disgust or shame or a disgust response, because they're seeing inside your viscera, inside your gut. But the shyness itself is part of spontaneity. So it either goes in that direction, as in terms of spontaneous playfulness, or if the parent is penetrating, I don't mean necessarily sexually, but penetrating with their attention, then that can turn into shame. And a lot of times when people feel the spontaneousness, they then fall back into shame. In other words, they don't get, wait a minute, this is actually a good feeling. This is a healthy feeling, a salubrious feeling.
That's really fascinating. I'm trying to think in a session, if I was working with someone in a session and that came up, where they kind of felt like there was a way that they were being penetrated in some shyness.
Or being seen.
Yes, or being seen. How I would sort of work with that so that it didn't fall in the shaming side, but into that more of that spontaneity and the flow of it.
That's right. Well, I think that's the key right there, is to be able to access that playfulness. The playfulness, yeah. And to appreciate the shyness. When you see 4-year-old kids and they're going like this is like, whoa, aren't I just great? and that's, and that's when the parent could be, yes, you are great. You are great. And by the way, you still have to eat your spinach.
Shame is such an interesting human emotion. It's a little different from guilt. Shame means you really want to hide. You don't want people to see you. So at the same time that you don't want people to know how humiliated, how embarrassed you are, it shows all over you. I mean, we are a culture in America that doesn't do very well with shame.
Why? Nobody wants to talk about it. Yes, we have a visceral reaction to the word shame. It's a painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. You know, there are specific memories that we can recall that can bring up shame for us. But there are also very insidious, quiet messages that we just marinate in over a lifetime. I think shame is lethal. I think shame is deadly. And I think we are swimming in it deep. Here's the bottom line with shame. The less you talk about it, the more you got it. Shame needs 3 things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment.
Yeah.
So you put shame in a petri dish.
Yeah.
And you douse it with a little secrecy, a little silence, and a little judgment. It grows exponentially. It will creep into every corner and crevice of your life. You put the same amount of shame in a petri dish, and you douse it with empathy. You've created an environment that is hostile to shame. It cannot survive empathy. So if I call you, if something really shaming happens to me,
and you talk about it,
and I call you and I say, "Oh God, Oprah, it's Brene, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm in such deep shame." And you say, "What's going on?" And I tell you, and you express empathy.
Yes.
Shame can't survive it. Shame depends on me buying in to the belief that I'm alone.
We hide from the human group that could help us. And not every member of our group, our chosen friends and our family, are necessarily the best for us at times of deep embarrassment. They make it worse. So I know what we try to do in Gift from Within is to cut through this, to say, yes, feeling humiliated is part of being victimized. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. And we're people who aren't going to make you feel worse because you're experiencing a sense of shame. Now, there are some people who should feel ashamed. They're perpetrators. They deliberately hurt other people. Unfortunately, they're beyond shame. Most of the time, they don't feel the shame. Their victims do.
Whether it is a child who witnesses violence or a child who is the victim, you can't be fearful and be able to live your normal life. You have to be able to think clearly, and when you're traumatized, you can't do that.
Violence continues then to affect the child and their perception of their community, of their family. The danger is right around the corner. And the brain gets wired to expect danger.
I started actually physically beating me to the point to where I'd go to school with covered in bruises. I don't know how many times I've been threatened to be killed by my own dad.
What trauma does is it triggers what's called the amygdala in the brain, which is our fight, flight, freeze center.
And it truly is a change in the brain and a change in the stress hormones that are flowing through the body.
All our brains have what we call alarm systems. Because the brain now has been wired for danger and it's triggered into this fight-flight, we don't just get over a traumatic event. It continues to impact us.
I started hearing my mom scream in the middle of the night. And it got to the point where he started beating me and my sisters. I let my anger build up, didn't talk to anybody about it.
Most kids who've experienced violence oftentimes have experienced multiple types of violence. In the kids we see, the average number of different types of violent trauma is 4. And so complex trauma then affects multiple areas of the brain because it's ongoing.
Maybe it's gang warfare, maybe it's drug use and abuse in the family, maybe it's domestic violence, maybe it's bullying at school. And if there is a layering effect of cumulative violence, it changes literally the DNA.
Re-experiencing it, having flashbacks, reliving it as if it were happening. Remember, our amygdala is part of our fight or flight instinct, and it cannot tell the difference between the event when it was happening and a thought about the event. It all feels urgent and same and happening this second. So the amygdala goes into its fight or flight response, which is to kind of start triggering the rest of the body to get ready to run away or kill something, which then also explains why when a person starts talking about the event or reliving the event in their head, their body starts responding as if it were happening. So racing heart, shallow breath, adrenaline getting ready to go, or anger because the adrenaline is releasing in the body and there's nowhere to run and nothing to kill. Bad dreams, nightmares, dreaming about the event, dreaming about the abuse, frightening thoughts, avoiding symptoms are staying away from places or things that remind us of the event, feeling emotionally numb. So oftentimes people will have PTSD and they will just be lights on, engine running, nobody home kind of thing. It's like there's just no emotion going on there. Strong feelings of guilt, depression, or worry, shame, or horror, shock, horror, guilt. I could have done something, I should have done something, I would have done something. Losing interest in activities that were enjoyable in the past, that's part of the depression coming out. Being easily startled, feeling tense or on edge, having difficulty sleeping, angry outbursts.
All of these things, from earthquakes to genocide to rape, things we find difficult to comprehend, are endured by human beings, some of them children. They result in traumatized human beings who live with recurring, tormenting memories of atrocities witnessed or borne. It infects their sleep with nightmares and destroys their relationships and their capacity to work and study. It torments their emotions, it shatters their faith, and it mutilates their hope. Many are simply rendered mute.
We was always aware that we got a really shy daughter from the word go, and
I know, they're so cute. Where did you get them?
I got them at
They can't go on not talking.
How can you have a relationship with a child who won't speak to you? And she wants to do it. She wants to be the same as everybody else.
But to speak a single word to those they love can seem impossible.
Are you ready to talk now?
Could I make you speak, maybe, if I tried hard enough, do you reckon?
It often comes over that these children are just doing it deliberately, they're just putting it on. But in fact, they couldn't maintain it for its intensity or for its persistence. There are children who have broken limbs and they haven't cried. There might be a silent tear, but there's no movement, no cry for help. They just could not maintain it that long if this was deliberate.
Can you talk? You can talk, but you don't talk. Why don't you talk, Red?
It's hard to explain. In the 8 years since she was born, they haven't heard her utter a word. Red finds the thought of speaking to Grandad and most other people strangely scary and stressful.
This very real, intense fear of talking to somebody or somebody hearing your voice. All those children are doing is controlling their own anxiety. By not speaking, they're removing themselves from the stress.
Trauma, you see, is extraordinary, not because it rarely happens, but because it completely overwhelms normal human coping. It swallows up and destroys normal human ways of living and learning. The usual response to atrocity is to try and remove it from the mind. Those who are victims of trauma want to forget, and we who hear it want to run also. We find it too terrible to remember and too incomprehensible to put into words. That's why we use the phrase, unspeakable atrocities. The great tension is the futile attempt to forget the unspeakable, but it still lives on in the mind, sometimes screaming. And that push-pull between the need to forget and the need to speak is the central dialectic of trauma.
Child sexual abuse exists in the neighborhood, exists unfortunately at our schools, at our churches, at our homes, everywhere. And there are children out there suffering.
My first assault was in high school. I met a guy at a church and he wanted to be my friend. I thought it'd be great. And instead he assaulted me and I felt very scared.
When you have a child that doesn't get to work through that abuse in an appropriate manner, that abuse doesn't go away. It lives in that child.
And found to be associated with a really unbelievable range of long-term impacts.
Very young children who are exposed to violence many times have difficulty in establishing a trusting relationship. These children have fears.
You're twice as likely to develop depression. You're probably 3 times as likely to develop some type of anxiety disorder.
As they move into school age, they may have very, very serious behavior problems. As we look at adolescence, we see children running away. Sometimes children may be involved in the juvenile justice system, which puts the child at risk for being an adult offender. And so the cost of violence is staggering.
I felt isolated.
Where were you when I was broken? While the days slip by from my window watching, and where were you when I was hurt and I was helpless? Because the things you say and the things you do surround me.
What makes post-traumatic stress disorder so difficult to deal with for the family and friends and for the person going through it is that when they are trying to discuss what happened, okay, and it's important that they be able to discuss what happened. Sadly, though, this reliving the event or talking about the event will cause this to start reacting, and then the person goes into, a panic attack type of thing, and they get re-traumatized. What I have seen happen is that the general population doesn't understand the re-traumatization part of it. They think, well, you should just be able to tell me and it should be fine. No, wrong, incorrect response. What I've seen is that, say, for example, somebody has been molested, and then they decide to file a lawsuit, and then, they haven't told anybody about the molestation, and they finally go to talk to a lawyer, and the lawyer says, well, you need to tell me everything, and so the client says everything, and then they are freaked out because this is the first time they've shared this with anybody, and the lawyer, of course, not being well-versed in psychology, goes, okay, great, we can do this case, goodbye, and sends this completely quivering mass of humanity out without making sure they're okay. So people that have gone through extremely extraordinary circumstances, trauma, dangerous event, etc., they're not just going to be able to share what happened. They're not, because it re-traumatizes them. So it's extremely important that the person with PTSD, whether that post-traumatic stress disorder came from an abusive relationship, a dangerous event, sexual molestation, surviving rape, whatever, that person get with a support group. Hugely important. You need to be with other people who have gone through the exact same or very similar thing so that you know you are not alone and that you are not crazy. And that's the big thing, is that oftentimes people with PTSD will come in and they'll be like, I'm broken. I'm like, no. Normal response to abnormal situation.
And listened, and you saw us, and now we remember we are human. Don't underestimate the power of listening and understanding in a person's life. That's part of the healing before you ever make a suggestion.
To make a sound, it takes an ear to hear it. Listening, I believe, is the missing half of communication. Absolutely necessary, but often overlooked. You see, there's this important difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is one of our natural senses, but listening requires focus and attention.
It's just quiet, and I listen to someone, despite all my judgments about them. I was able to grab hold of things that were so much better. Kindness, compassion, connection. And it happened because I listened in a way that I don't usually listen when I think I'm right. Now that was really humbling to me because I always thought I was a good listener. But my conversation with her made me curious, like, wow, where else am I not a good listener? What are the things that I don't know that I don't even know I don't know? And can I become more of a deliberate good listener instead of a coincidental one? Well, what I learned about deliberate listening has changed every one of my relationships. And I think it can change the world.
What goes on in this world. And unless we know how to take care of ourselves, we will not be able to continue to bear witness because we will burn up, dry up, fall away. So it is an occupational hazard, vicarious traumatization, if you do any kind of work with trauma survivors. But it is not something people do to us, but rather it is a human consequence of having empathy. Because when you have empathy, you open up a door to your heart, and other things get in it. So if you really have empathy for somebody who's been traumatized, the horrific things that have happened to them will come through that door in your heart, and you can easily find yourself also overwhelmed and shutting down. So self-care is pretty important, and there's some irony to that because you're trying in safety and stabilization and all the way through to teach these people how to be safe and stable, which requires self-care. It's very easy for us to drop that in our own lives. It means physical things. Food, exercise, sleep, medical care, schedule, recreation, all of those things. We are working with people who are in crisis and don't know how to take care of their bodies. And if we don't take care of ours, we're mirroring them. That's backwards. Sometimes in imminent crises right in the moment, those things are unavoidable. But if we continue for the long haul not to care for ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, we will not continue or we will become dangerous to the victims. We all need good supportive relationships because those have a tremendous impact on our own resiliency and mental health. Pain tends to isolate. And after you've heard some stories of horrific trauma, you go places and you think, Nobody knows. Questions. What kind of lies did this child learn about who she is? About who others are? What did she learn as an adolescent? And you look at the things she should have been learning. So you can list. She learned mistrust. She learned, all those things. And when you sit across from a lovely, well put together, competent adult, and the first is that we really understand the person in front of us. And again, that's part of what that exercise was about. It's not just the person you see, but who they've been throughout the lifespan before they came to you. And you want to truly see them.
Mrs. Gull came in and she just gave Jerry a great big hug. I couldn't have been more proud. To see Mrs. Gull just accept Jerry so unconditionally, immediately love her, was just the most rewarding experience. She's helped to nurture Jerry's personality. Mrs. Gull's just a fantastic mum. She's there for Jerry when she needs those cuddles and those mum moments, but she's also very good at pushing Jerry and growing that confident side of Jerry's personality. It's taking her time to be like, okay, these monkeys are going to look after me. She's connecting with the monkeys that are going to be her family.
Remember how we did it last time? Yes, you asked me questions and then you said for me to repeat in my head. Yes. You take a deep breath. Hold it. Let it out. Take another deep breath. Let it out. Good. Inside your head, can you see the words relax? Yes. So you're going to look at those words and you can also feel what relax would feel like in your body. Take a deep breath in. Hold it. Let it out. Good. And that became a yawn. Say 3 words again. Yes, I can. You're saying it in your head, right? You're going to think about a time where you felt really good about yourself, like you could do it. You could do anything. You were really sure that you were the person that could get things done. Tell me when you thought of something. She looks so cute now. So relaxed. See, she knows how to relax. She's like, this is the life. She's like, I'm done. I would talk to my friend. I am learning to catch the voice in my head when it's not saying nice things. I am learning new words to teach the voice inside my head to say to me. I deserve love. Yes, I do. Real love does not hurt. I am allowed to say no and smile. Yes, I am. Right, but I really want you to try to hear that little voice whenever I say this stuff. I am. And you remember all this stuff is how I really feel about you. I really feel it in my heart. I know. So pay attention to what that little voice says when I talk to you and it, and try to remember. Okay? Wait first. Okay. You are smart. You are doing great. You are creative. You are strong. You have a really kind heart. You are curious, and I love that about you. You can be a great leader. You are an awesome detective. Everything is okay. You're doing fine just being you. I like who you are. I love who you are becoming. I believe in you. I believe you are a good person. You are doing so good with your boundaries. You are such a good friend.
You are such a great student. You're really funny and make me laugh. I enjoy being around you. I like your company. The house feels better with you in it. Your family really loves you. I miss you so much if you weren't in my life. You matter. Your feelings matter. Your opinions matter. I want to hear how you feel. I want to hear what you think. You have really cool ideas. Your feelings are all normal. I am always here for you.